Hi everyone, hope everyone's doing fantastic. Recently I released an album onto my Bandcamp page called SAPARi.Millennium, a sequel to one of my earlier works years back, named SAPARi.wrl. For 2 years I worked on this album wanting to create a fitting follow-up to that project. As a creative, I don't really tend to release music projects for particular reasons, mostly just wanting to have a bit of fun, but with the recent interest in the album, especially here on YouTube, and a few people wanting to know about its production, I thought I'd do a bit of a different video and instead give you all a comprehensive breakdown of how I made the album, SAPARi.Millennium, as well as dissecting the little references and details I've snuck within. So sit back, get a cuppa, and let's do a comprehensive breakdown of SAPARi.Millennium, going track by track. Starting off, we have A New Morning for the Ancient Machine. This track, which is the first of many interludes within the album and also serves as the first track, is a bit more of an ambient piece for the most part, followed by a more traditional melody in its second half. With designing SAPARi.Millennium, I actually wanted to create a bit of an overarching narrative for this album, using a variety of sound effects to create the mental imagery of someone exploring an abandoned place, footsteps echoing through an empty space, birds chirping, searching for a computer, someone searching for a computer. The idea was to imagine someone, an unknown figure, trying to seek this computer out for reasons yet to be understood. Once the person stops audibly moving, they boot up a Windows 95 computer, the Microsoft sound echoing through the space, of which then boots into a jingle, of which I use my music software, LMMS, to repeat. The jingle itself is actually a looped snippet taken from a 2001 CNN weather forecast on television. This is a sample which I originally first used within my second album ever, Octrogene. Octrogene's first track, Morning Broadcast, uses this jingle as a sample, but 3 years on from using it in Octrogene, I always kind of found my process with making that track to be a little cumbersome. So, fitting with deciding to make an album that closes a chapter on my musical production life, and being the final real album I will ever make with LMMS, as I'm moving over to FL Studio, I wanted to call back to one of my earlier works while also improving it, using it for something new. It's fitting with the fact that SAPARi itself and all that surrounds it is so focused on the past of reinventing parts of it nowadays in the modern community, so I wanted to do that as well. Adding electronic guitars and a new melody, then reversing it, ultimately was really fun, and I am glad I was able to give this sample some new life. The end of this track is accompanied by text-to-speech from fasthub.net of a version of Microsoft SAM, Welcome Back to SAPARi, Loading Millennium version.
Welcome back to SAPARi, Loading Millennium version.
The idea with this text-to-speech and the kind of introduction I had built here was to give the impression that whoever was seeking this computer out was after relaunching the world within it, all that encompasses it, like a digital black hole of sorts. From here, this leads into the first main track of the album, Neco Genesis. Neco Genesis is the second track of the album. The name of the track is derived from the SAPARi cat itself, but also how a genesis generally implies the start of something, fitting with its place in the album as the second track, but at the album's general beginning. I actually originally wanted to make Neco Genesis the first track in the album way back when. The initial version of this track, of which is at the end of the album, the prototype, was made around 2 years ago. However, as I kept developing the album, this track began to feel incredibly outdated, so this version is the version that I updated and feel the happiest about, the one that's at the start of the album anyway. I wanted a track that felt like it was rising, as if it represents the rise of SAPARi's popularity, during those COVID years. This is one of those tracks that I generally had a lot of fun working on due to using a variety of different samples ranging from bit-crushed voices to even a single second of the Microsoft sound, which composes the main melody and overall sound of the track. This track was kind of like the progenitor of a lot of new sounds for me, as from here I developed the middle melody into something of its own, resulting in a motif that I'd come to use in a lot of my more recent works. More on that soon. I originally didn't intend to go too all out with this track, with it being around 3 minutes in length, but as I wanted to make it feel like a strong opener, and I wanted to keep it updated as I became better at making music, I decided to add a new section which incorporated use of Microsoft SAM TTS, sampled Haze to imitate a rave or a chorus, and then the utilization of my own voice. The idea of it was to make the track feel like people were rising up, in a sense, spreading SAPARi far and wide, being unified as one, which I feel is really incorporated within the ending of this track as all the voices coalesce together and cap off the track. I'm still really happy with this one. It feels right for this release, and I'm glad that I took a lot of time to actually work on this one and update it, as I updated it so much over the years and I was just never satisfied with how it sounded. It took a lot of time to get to the point where I felt comfortable fully realizing this track's potential, but I feel like I did, and I'm happy. Cyber Emperors is a track that I have a lot of thoughts on. Originally I created Cyber Emperors with the intent of just trying to use similar samples to that of Neco Genesis. You see, Neco Genesis became the baseline standard for what tracks I wanted to make, the level of quality I strive to achieve. So naturally I wanted to make a track that felt as strong as Neco Genesis, if that makes sense, but unique in its own right. Cyber Emperors is a track that I can say achieved that objective. The track primarily uses another small snippet of the Microsoft sound, this time bit crushed more so with a little bit of reverb. The piano you hear within this song is actually the same one used within Sonic CD's Wacky Workbench Past. It's kind of a good sample, not gonna lie. And I'm happy to use it whenever I can because it has this particular quality to it that I enjoy. After this, however, the song transitions into lyrics. The lyrics themselves are done again with Microsoft SAM TTS, manually aligned together in LMMS, which to be honest was both fun and stressful to do, more so the former. The lyrics tell the tale of SAPARi's start, how it declined, how something like this, if released now, would be merely manipulated and corrupted by companies in their own bid for selfish gain, merely just a thing that would be sapped of its creativity and mauled by the greedy metaverse Web3 types. When I was creating Cyber Emperors, I was incredibly frustrated. In the past few years, the internet in general has seen a rise in a lot of, in my opinion, pretty scummy stuff that's been consuming art and the creative space as a whole. NFTs and their scams, metaverse content, crypto, egotistical CEOs and their pushing of AI-generated garbage, tools that artificially give people advantages over others and cut out the hard work and love that goes into artistic expression of all kinds. All of this had been getting under my skin. As someone who had their name tied to SAPARi and its creativity and all that exists within it, especially from the start of the modern community, I was angered at the time with the state of the internet, and I decided to create a track within this album that not only incorporates the story of SAPARi, but how the internet has become extremely bastardized by bad actors who would probably attempt to use something like SAPARi for their own greedy gain. The name of the track, Cyber Emperors, is a reference to how I think these people see themselves as emperors in a cyber realm who think they can rise above the genuine hard work of people who actually put the time into trying to learn and improve and strive to be creative. The second half of the track, accordingly, is a big callback to Cyberpiece from the original SAPARi.wrl, almost a contorted version of it, while text-to-speech describes returning to that cyberpiece over the current state of things. The track ends with the message that SAPARi and Susto will never die, being etched in memory forever. More on Susto in a bit. I decided to put this here for two reasons: to emphasize that SAPARi won't falter, unlike the Web3 garbage, which will, ultimately, and that even something like SAPARi and fan-made stuff revolving around the character, the cat, can't falter either. The callback to Cyberpiece from SAPARi.world was not actually intended, but it was a happy accident nonetheless, and I noticed it as soon as I made it, so I decided to intentionally incorporate it. Personally, I'm glad I made a track like this, as I want people to understand SAPARi's place within internet culture, but to also emphasize how it's something that rises beyond that Web3 grift, if you get what I mean. Honjo engine is one of my favourites. I wanted something that felt slower paced, something that felt really ancient sounding. I wanted with Honjo engine to make something really groovy as well, something that immediately doesn't use the same kind of overall samples from Neco Genesis and Cyber Emperors. I wanted to go for something that could feel both ancient sounding and groovy, the ancient sounding part being fitting as I wanted a track within this album that actually referenced Honjo Jidai Mura, SAPARi community place's direct predecessor. A lot of the samples here that have been used have a lot of history to them. The main melody comes from Gran Turismo 3's Menu, one of the menu sounds of which I originally used way back on my Patchworks Volume 1 release. The shamisen is also derived from past use in that album. Parts of the track reference the melody of Neco Genesis, but the most prominent sample I used was an excerpt of Fat Man Scoop's Be Faithful, specifically the 1 minute 52 mark, which samples The Choice Is Yours Revisited by Black Sheep. I isolated the vocals by removing background noise, and in what I feel was probably one of the best uses of sampling I've ever done, I essentially looped that excerpt over the second half of the track. I was astounded by how well it fit, to be honest. I intended to sample more of Be Faithful more directly and use Fat Man Scoop's direct haze, but it just didn't fit. On the note of using samples, the reason I ended up sampling Fat Man Scoop to begin with was because I actually originally intended to have lyrics for this track, trying to be consistent with Cyber Emperors, but the lyrics were cut, as to be honest, I didn't feel exactly comfortable with using my own voice for singing. There is a certain irony to me saying that when I use text-to-speech, but I can tell when I don't have a singing voice, and that's fine by me. I don't recall the exact nature of the lyrics, but I do recall that some parts of them were focused on the digital immortality of something like Honjo Jidai Mura, how it was based off of an actual Japanese town or so from hundreds of years ago, now to be preserved in the confines of polygons. Midday aboard Nomoc's Everblue boat. As the fifth track on the album and the second interlude of it, I wanted something that kept up the narrative I had planted, started from the very first track and very first interlude. For now, the narrative is somewhat vague, but across the album it will flesh out more. This interlude is actually a tweaking of a very old track, at least a few months to a year after the release of SAPARi.world. I decided that I wanted something simple, so I simply added a bit of percussion and a bass to the track, and applied some fixes in mixing. I think it's simple enough, but I think it works for that reason. At the end of the track, the click of a mouse can be heard. I put this in for a reason. I wanted to give the impression of this interlude being some kind of musical jingle or software that whoever is accessing the computer within the album's narrative is interacting with. The name of the track comes from the game's overall creator, Tsunetake Noma, and his company, Everblue, which deals in boats. Nomoc Chromatica. Nomoc Chromatica is one of the tracks on the album that was the earliest worked on, although it came after Neco Genesis. The name references Tsunetake Noma, but the track itself is a pseudo-remix of Nomochrome from SAPARi.world, utilising a similar structure to its second half. I took inspiration from the second half of Nomochrome, and I accordingly made a track that felt fast-paced. I wanted a faster track within the album, because I usually work with very slow, methodical tracks, or at least, upbeat enough. I wanted something that genuinely felt fast this time though. Within this track is the inclusion of a motif that first appeared within Neco Genesis. Sort of. Allow me to explain. Since the release of Cathode Transit Highway, one of my more recent releases, although originating to an extent within Gamma AM, and having originally stemmed from a modification of Neco Genesis' original version, I created a melody which serves as the musical theme of a story I've been working on for some time, named Philanthropy, featuring my own original characters, including the avatar you see here, Petraore, who is also essentially the mascot of my main content on this channel, CRT Dreams. The philanthropy motif has since become a recurring thing within my work, be it intentional or otherwise, kind of like my own version of the lick, if you get the reference. Accordingly, a part of the melody from the bit-crushed electric guitar snipped to a single second is the philanthropy motif in Nomoc. I didn't really have a specific intent with using it here really, likewise the inclusion of the Fat Man Scoop Be Faithful sample from Honjo Engine, which was originally just meant for Honjo Engine. I felt that these inclusions were a fun little experiment. Overall, this is a track I like, although it is heavily altered from its original version. Like Neco Genesis, this track took a lot of time, and there is an original version of this track that I just didn't put on the album. Why? I didn't really feel that it was up to par, and I also didn't really feel like going back to it. One day, perhaps I may release that version. Overall, Chromatica had a specific intent to it, of which a few tracks within the album share, to essentially have updated or better versions, remixes of sorts, of tracks from the predecessor album, SAPARi.wrl, from years ago, and improve on what already exists. I am someone who loves to improve on stuff that I've already put out, even if that means 5 years later I'll be putting out an album that's a sequel to something that many people don't remember. I am a person who is obsessed with improvement in that regard, and I believe that Chromatica is a very good representation of that, or at least tries to be. Millennium Generation Vioscope. For this track, I had a similar intent to Chromatica. I wanted to create an updated version of Vioscope from SAPARi.wrl, which I always felt was a track from that album that had more potential, really. It's not really specific to this track, but I'm still impressed with the fact that I was able to create a usable sample from an old Vio boot-up sound, hence the name Vioscope. As for the Millennium Generation part, it actually comes from an abandoned older project that eventually became what is now known as Gamma AM, one of my older releases. I figured that since I just liked the name and the fact that SAPARi had a bit of a presence within the Millennium, combining the two names together to emphasize an updated or remixed version of Vioscope felt right to me. In terms of the track, this is one of them that really benefited over time from my natural evolution as a musician, as I was able to eventually finish the second half of the track 2 years later. See, originally I created the first half of the track, but then I had some major musicians block, and I abandoned the track for about 2 or so years until I was able to eventually complete it. In terms of the melody, it follows Vioscope to a T almost, with the exception of the end portion. This was something that is actually an oversight in retrospect. I did not intend this, but the penultimate melody of the track before it closes out is actually a lower pitched version of the main melody of Quantum Rain from Patchwork's Volume 2. I had intended to change it, but it just fit you know? So ultimately, I'm quite happy with Millennium Generation Bioscope, and I feel like I managed to create something that was fairly groovy by complete accident. Wayback window. Wayback window's name is a reference in two parts. It's a big old reference to the Wayback Machine, fitting as it was used to dig into the game and its history, ultimately leading to the current day net presence that SAPARi has within the generally Western world, and my video. And then the second half is that it's a reference to Windows, the primary operating system that the game runs off of, and what the computer in the album's narrative is running off of. The main core sound of this track actually comes from Windows Longhorn. Yeah, very strange decision there, isn't it? See, I've always had a fascination with boot up sounds, logo sounds, all of that in particular, and all of those interesting boot up and shutdown sounds as well. There's something about Windows boot up sounds in particular and their general sound design of their older operating systems that I particularly like. I did grow up with Windows XP, so I am quite biased. But generally, I had fun using Longhorn's unique sound for a time here. This track actually started off as a singular one before it split itself into two tracks, Wayback Window being one of them and Vermal Party being the other, but more on that track in a bit. Overall, I wanted something with a bit more of a trap beat, something a little more synthy and out there, familiar to the kind of track I would make in albums before this one. That clicking sound that you can hear actually, that serves as a hi-hat, is actually the baseball sounds included within older versions of Windows for some reason. I like using unusual sounds for hi-hats, it's a recurring habit of my music, and I feel like Wayback Window is a very good representation of the kind of tracks that I like to make just on a whim, in that I like making tracks that use so many weird little pieces, like baseball sounds for hi-hats, Longhorn for the main synth, like, I don't know, I just like making music in that regard by using such strange samples. It's very much a me kind of thing, and I'm happy that it is. Tiny Aibo, Toro Inoue, SAPARi and Susto have a conversation. Now, there's a bit of context for this one. You see, it's kind of a pseudo-meme of sorts within the SAPARi community that SAPARi is related to Tiny Aibo and Toro Inoue. For those unfamiliar with Tiny Aibo, the Aibos were a series of robotic pets designed by Sony in the late 90s, although the series is mainly associated with the cute little robo-dogs you see when you look into it. As for Toro Inoue, the little fella has been considered to be Sony's unofficial cat mascot for some time, appearing in his own little video games and everything. He's a cute little fella. In terms of Susto though, well, what is Susto? To give context, Susto is a community myth assumedly created by longtime community contributor Slate Cube. The character first appeared as an ominous JPEG on the SAPARi Community Place Discord server, in which it then spread like wildfire. Over time, the character of Susto, portrayed as a black and white polygonal phantom of the real SAPARi cat, became characterized as a lonely ghost, somewhat of the inverse of SAPARi cat, whom is often portrayed in fan arts as goofy or silly. I wanted to create a track that felt very lo-fi in a sense, something you'd hear on a 24-hour, 7 days a week lo-fi stream on YouTube. I will admit I have a long way to go with really getting a feel for that genre of music, but being able to portray my interpretation of how these four characters would interact felt nice to me. I used sounds from the respective sources of Aibo and Toro Inoue, with the hello sound from SAPARi as from the game being used to represent SAPARi. I modified the latter sound with bit crushing and lower pitch to represent Susto. In terms of the why with this track, this interlude, I wanted to give the impression that SAPARi had their own character to them, that they were something more than just an avatar, that in a way they have quite the big connected lineage, being connected to these three other characters in some way, shape or form. It also felt right to have something focused on the actual SAPARi too, and an interlude that felt a little bit more abstract. I definitely want to pursue doing more lo-fi based music in the future. This was mainly just a test that I wanted to do, and I also wanted a bit of a calm interlude after all the very chaotic and very in-your-face sounds of the past few interludes. Polygon Sky. Polygon Sky was an attempt at being more of a somewhat abstract track, with the beat itself being irregular. I wanted this intentionally. The main sound, believe it or not, comes from the Apple Pippin boot screen, shortened heavily, like by a second I think. I've made it a bit of a habit to make boot screen jingles and simps in stuff like weather broadcast and logos into short form sounds that I can use for melodic reasons, and that's something I like about Polygon Sky, and my music in general. The name itself comes from how I'd imagine the sky to be within SAPARi as a game, also made of polygons and shapes, just like everything else is in that game. One thing of note is the use of a melody from an unused track originally meant for Patchwork's Volume 1. I ended up reusing this track and retrofitting it into this album, but the melody was first implanted within Polygon Sky before I was sure to use it anywhere else. I'll talk more about that track soon. I don't really have too much else to say other than that I made this track while I was watching the Hunger Games at midnight. No idea why particularly at that point, but oh well, if you want a bit of trivia, there you go. I will say the flute that I used, I mainly used it, now that I think about it, because I was thinking about Clone Noah 2 at the time. A lot of that game's soundtrack, especially in its latter half, tends to use flutes or whistles, and I really like that. And when I think of something like a Polygon Sky, I'll be either thinking of SAPARi or I'll be thinking of a game like Clone Noah 2, which has a lot of really stunning visuals. So subconsciously I was probably thinking about Clone Noah 2 while making this one. Ticking Time. Ticking Time is a very simple track, but I wanted a dissonant feel to it. Utilising the philanthropy motif, because why not, I wanted it to feel like a sleuthy ambient track, with the intent of it feeling like a passage of time. Something I forgot to mention is that, albeit a little haphazardly, the intent of the interludes was to essentially act as points of time in the album's narrative. The first interlude is early morning, the second is midday, the third is this afternoon, etc. Ticking Time was intended as such to be a track that felt like the sun was settling, like sunset, that time is ticking away. I don't feel like I entirely got that across, but the attempt was still fun nonetheless. I feel that this is a track that more or less fits something like Gamma AM, rather than SAPARi.Millennium, but I felt it was a fun inclusion nonetheless. I like having music of all walks of life, I guess, in that regard, on my albums, and I like having older stuff on my albums as well as the newer stuff, so I'm glad I included it. Vermal Party. I've referred to Vermal Party as being originally part of Wayback Window, in that the two tracks were originally one track, which then split into two. But as said when talking about that, they essentially began as one and the same. Whereas Wayback Window is a little more methodical, I wanted Vermal Party to feel like a rave, imagining this idea of people raving inside a Vermal-style nightclub. It's silly, but that was the thought process behind it. I wanted something that sounded a tad crazy, energetic, a little overboard, and it helped to use synths for a lot of this. LMMS's presets really work when it comes to just making tracks, honestly. A long time ago, I generally used to think it was lazy of me to use them, fearing that I'd be seen as unoriginal just by using them. I know, very paranoid, but utilising these things and getting really creative with applying and varying the melodies, creating variation in effect, it's a challenge, but it's really fun. But that's also why I'm moving to FL Studio, as I want to experiment even more, beyond just using presets and the plethora of samples that I have. Tracks like Vermal Party make me wonder what my style will be like in, say, a year or two's time, honestly, in terms of music. In terms of this track overall, this one took a while to complete, mainly because I was not satisfied with the second half. I wanted something that felt crazy and really sporadic, and I just didn't feel like I was getting anywhere with not only mastering and controlling volume, but also just making it just sound right, if that makes sense. Ultimately, I did get somewhere with it, but I would probably make the track less chaotic if I, say, had to remake this someday in FL Studio. Network. I actually began work on Network during the creation process of other tracks such as Honjo Engine and Polygon Sky. I wanted, really, a track that had a naturalistic approach, a track that felt like mycelium, spores, an interconnected network of nerves. I wanted this as I generally feel that SAPARi and the presence it has online has grown like a network, like mushrooms, like mycelium in that regard, and the way that plant life communicates. If you can't tell, I do have an interest in that kind of thing. There's a natural feel to SAPARi in this digital way, and I wanted to convey that here. I wanted it to seem strange sounding, hence the droopy synths and the amen breaks. Amen breaks are something I love using in music, and with the kind of artists I've seen on platforms like TikTok and YouTube that use them, it inspires me to learn. Like mycelium, mushrooms, I'm a bit of a mimetic creature. Rather than generally looking at manuals, I am haphazard. Outright, I admit that. I do not like reading manuals. I am someone who learns from doing rather than sitting around for 3 hours straight doing nothing, which is probably why I learn music so slowly, realistically. So, with stuff like amen breaks, I learn through doing. Failure is merely a ladder to success for me. Network is a track that encompasses that mindset I have, in that it took me some time to really get through its creation process, but the results were more than worth it. I did want it to sound dissonant from the start, to be honest. I like having a bit of consistency and, a particular feel or vibe to music, so being able to create something that felt so dissonant and weird, kind of like mycelium, was a bit of a fun challenge for me. Night errors. Here's a question for you all. How many of you remember disk error screens on video game consoles when you were younger? How many of you experienced that haunted, forbidden, violative feeling like you've been caught red-handed doing something bad? That feeling of those screens stuck with me for a long time. Night Errors is a track sort of based on that, taking the Microsoft sound and essentially distorting it. Actually, more accurately, it's a hyper slowed down version of Cyberpiece from SAPARi.wrl, Paul stretched in Audacity. The more dissonant, weird sound is the VIO boot up screen, slowed down also using Paul stretch. In terms of the day-night cycle that I mentioned when I was talking about ticking time, this falls into the night portion. I wanted something that felt like you were caught red-handed, something hostile and haunting. It's something that I already had done for SAPARi.wrl, but I wanted to do something that felt even more pungent in that feeling, if you know what I mean. It's a very simple track, but simple doesn't mean bad to me, more so just specific in its utilization, doing things much simpler to achieve more interesting results. I also like this track because it generally designates the halfway point of the album. The sun has set, the night has come, and the more vivid tracks are due to greet your ears. I do like the way that this track particularly ends. It reminds me of one of my older tracks in the Octogene era of my music, in which I would generally end off a lot of my tracks on some sort of particular note or haunted note, just to kind of get a rise out of people in that regard. It's quite nostalgic to me. Cube slates. Cube slates is a lot of things. It's a track that I enjoy for being a bit longer than most of the others, but it's also a bit of a tribute to a friend. During the early years of the modern SAPARi movement, the community that exists now, the 2020 to 2021 era, I had a friend named Slate Q. They were originally from the Osamu Sato community, of which the SAPARi revival movement and community originated. Slate was one of the first people around and also one of the most creative. Slate, myself, and a few others were set on creating a Friday Night Funkin' SAPARi mod, back when Funkin' was going through its long years of hyper-relevancy during lockdown, but plans fell through, and without warning, unfortunately, Slate just kind of disappeared one day. To this day, I don't really know what happened to Slate, but I dearly miss them, and the creativity that they had. They are the origin creator of Susto, one of the community's most beloved characters, and I really hope they know how much they are appreciated, to be honest. I thus decided to immortalise Slate in this album with a track that felt as esoteric as the work that they made, their artwork, their style to things. Utilising samples from Res, I envisioned the cube slates as essentially the backing track of a Res level. I really loved that game, so I wanted something really abstract in tandem with an appearance by the philanthropy motif once again in tow. There's one big thing with this track that I particularly regret, and that's shortening it. At the time, I took advice on how to keep the album concise from people that I fortunately do not associate with any longer, but cutting out a whole minute of cube slates made the middle melody, that bit, and what becomes the ending melody feel a tad anticlimactic, for which I am not a fan of. I haven't really heard any criticism about cube slates in that regard, but personally I'm not that keen on how much of it I cut down. So if I ever do any re-releases of this album at any point, the true version of cube slates is on the docket for me to master and do. Modem Sun. I have something to explain about my naming process when it comes to Modem Sun. With my naming scheme for tracks, I tend to go for something punchy, something with a bit of oomph to it, you know what I mean? Neco Genesis, Cyber Emperors, Nomoc Chromatica, Wayback Window, etc. Emphasis and the occasional alliteration is really fun for naming tracks, but sometimes I just come up with names before the tracks are even made. Modem Sun is an example of this, as I wanted to specifically make a track that felt like that of a modem dialing up, fitting of the era. There's a certain oomph to Modem Sun, you know? It makes you think, what does this mean? Does this have meaning? To me, Modem Sun is essentially a bit of a cheeky joke. At this point within the album, it's the night portion, so there's no room for a sun overhead now, just a settling one. Dialing down. You get what I mean? Yeah, I know I'm not funny. Generally, I also just think it sounds cool. A bit of a brag, but I'm actually quite pleased with my utilisation of dial-up sounds here, as there's a certain catchiness to it. I love using samples like this, but I don't tend to always use them like this because it can be quite difficult. Still, I love myself a challenge. This is another track, like Network, that I made generally to tinker with while I was working on other tracks and the like, but it evolved into its own thing by the album's production cycle coming to an end. Taxim. Taxim is probably the strangest inclusion on the album, honestly. Firstly, the name doesn't really mean anything. I just think it sounds kinda cool. But secondly, its creation was the result of a genuine freak accident while working on the end portion of Nomoc Chromatica. I ended up pitching down a melody within the end portion of Nomoc Chromatica to an absurdly deep pitch, and it ended up creating the melody of Taxim. I thought this melody sounded genuinely kinda cool with the different pitch, so I thought, hey, why not add this kind of rough in-your-face track built from the echoes of Nomoc Chromatica into a part of the album that thematically fits the more loose, strange feel. So I did. It's a short track and it mainly relies on repetition, but I like having shorter tracks in my works. It sounds a bit silly, but Boards of Canada, one of my main inspirations, like for music overall, listening to them made me realise that music can basically be any length, provided that there's something in there, you know, be it abstract, noise, or a melody to boot. I don't really have too much to say about Taxim. I like what I did here. I would have probably made it a longer track if I was intending to do that, but I'm happy with the length that it is, and I kind of like the grungier feel to it. 53, 75, 73, 74... Okay, I'm not gonna say the full thing. Okay, let's just get into this one. So, a few people have asked me, what the hell does this track's title mean? The track's title is in hexadecimal. Simply put, it means SAPARi and Susto. Why did I decide to name it with hexadecimal like this? Why the hell not? Okay, so a bit of lore. This track was actually made for a little fan festival in the musical SAPARi space called SapFest. I created this as a submission for it back in 2022. The event was pretty obscure, even in all of what SAPARi is in the current age, so unsurprisingly it didn't really receive much coverage initially. This is probably the most unrefined of the tracks, but that's due to the age of it and how little it resembles my current style, let alone anything on the album actually. But I felt that it was a fitting inclusion. I felt it was fitting to actually include this track, as its rarity is something that made me a little sad, and I wished it would get a little bit more visibility. I did put this in my Archives Volume 1 album, but you know, an album that's 40 plus tracks long and is mostly just archival material of an era of my musical life that people have gone past at this point, that I've moved on from. Naturally, it probably didn't get that much attention, which is fair, but I decided that I wanted to give it a little bit more time in the sunshine. I wanted something that, with this track, was generally a little bit more abstract, the result being that it felt pretty organic and alive, breathing in that regard. Utilising the VIO boot up sound for this purpose was pretty nice, as was positioning the sound effects to give off the idea that SAPARi avatars were communicating with each other. I think it's a cute little idea that really probably inspired the day to night cycle going on within the album now, and probably the overall narrative I am going for, which I will elaborate on in due enough time. Midnight into Dreams. This interlude is important, as it is a full return to the narrative that began with the very first interlude, the very first track. For the first time, we hear the voice of the person behind the computer, who's clearly trying to access more of it, but the faulty hardware echoes and reverberates with grunts of frustration. Things, quite literally, reverse, and with the lateness of the day, a simple yawn is enough to send this person into dreamland. A world past the confines of midnight comes to life in dreams. A familiar melody of Neco Genesis from all the way back at the very start of the album, with the voice of PachiiMochii, my avatar, and the mascot of this very channel, almost guiding the person into this dreamland, this temporary rest. Funnily enough, due to the length of the track, I was actually tempted to make it into a full track, but it feels fitting that this interlude, the start of the trippiest, wildest tracks, has such an abstract and almost ethereal feeling to it. Solar by digitaldidgeridoo. Here is where a fun fact about the album comes to light. Originally, this album was meant to be a collaborative project. With the SAPARi music community and the main community, I had intended for this album to be more or less a communal expression of love about SAPARi and the cat, the game, but unfortunately collaboration as a core part of the album just fell through. Fortunately though, I ended up getting at least two people on board, digitaldidgeridoo and my good friend Trashman. Both of them produced some absolutely brilliant tracks. Seeing as this and Trashman's submission are not my own, if they so wish, I'll plug their socials in the comment section and description so they can get a bit of traction from their work being here. Honestly though, digitaldidgeridoo's track as the beginning of the midnight section of the album feels really fitting, given the more airy and floaty feel to the whole thing. I always generally liked that this track didn't feel intense. I have a tendency to go overboard with my sound. I want every part of the track to be heard. However, that's not always possible, so I'm glad that tracks like this one exist to also inspire me to try and broaden my horizons a bit, while I, in return, can give a bit of attention to it. I love this one, and I would love to work with digitaldidgeridoo again at some point on another musical project. Roundabout. Roundabout is a strange inclusion when I think about it a little bit. This is a track that I was tinkering with years ago. Its inclusion in the album mainly stems from how I originally put it within PachiiMochii's Archives Volume 1, Seeing as it was made just sometime after SAPARi.wrl and how I felt that it had some potential, even if it did feel a little bit outdated, I decided to subsequently just tweak and finish it. The name of the track mainly comes from how I feel that the sound of the track looping, circling back into itself, feels like a roundabout. I feel that this is a track I may revisit in the future someday, mainly because the sound is so unique to me. I feel this way about a lot of my older projects, especially those not particularly connected to any sort of album, that they have potential to be explored more. I do wonder if I'll be going back to these and a lot of other tracks once I'm fully on FL Studio. Not much more to say about this one, although I do like the kind of ambient feel that this one has. Hotline to No One by Trashman. Here lies the second contributed track of the album, Hotline to No One, made by my friend Trashman. I really love this one because of, one, the earthbound samples / instruments that I can hear in this, but also how methodically groovy it feels. It has this surreal feeling to it that I just really enjoy, and it really fits the midnight portion of the album, that aloofness fitting in like a knife into butter. Honestly, it feels like a track that you'd probably find being covered by some famous band in the 70s or 80s. I can imagine Earth, Wind and Fire playing this one. I'm not trying to glaze or overhype my friend here, but that's how I think when it comes to this track. The only thing of note that I can really say about the track, other than it being pretty fantastic, is that it had to go through a few volume tweaks before it got into the album, as it was quite quiet. To both Digital Didgeridoo and Trashman, your work is fantastic, and I would love to have you both in future projects again. It was seriously really nice being able to have some contributor work on this project. Much appreciated, you two. Rascal in Motion, theme of PachiiMochii, unreleased from Cathode Transit Highway. This is a really odd inclusion, but I feel that in retrospect it made sense. You see, this track is actually a leftover from Cathode Transit Highway being the theme of my character, PachiiMochii. If you recall, he's my cute little cat avatar that serves as my main original character, as well as a character within the philanthropy story / project I mentioned earlier within this video, and also the mascot of my main content on this channel, CRT Dreams. I originally made PachiiMochii for CRT Dreams. Fun fact, I had a dream about wanting to have my own video essay series, and I envisioned a cute little animal, furry mascot, pretty much. And while I had originally intended to name him after my real name, I really liked the idea of him having patches, so his name quickly became PachiiMochii. The surname came much later. Anyway, he's evolved over the years, but I wanted to essentially give him a theme, a tune of sorts, a bit of world building. While it does seem a little random to include this for the end section of the album, I feel that it fits quite well. More on that soon, and you'll get why this track is here. In terms of the actual sound, the track contains the philanthropy motif, PachiiMochii's own motif, and primarily uses a particularly amusing sample, one with a bit of history to it. You see, I began my musical projects and learning to make music in LMMS all the way back in 2021, releasing my very first project, Blob Jams, in August of that year. The primary track of that project is a track called Television Obsession, meant to be this track about the addictivity of television screens and the obsessiveness that's magnetized to the entire subject. At the time, it was really hard to define that theme in an overt way, but that was the intent of it. Rascal in Motion was, in a way, built up from the same concept and reused for good measure, including the core sample. For anyone with a keen ear, or if you really love a certain green lizard, you'll recognize that the sample is the Gex 3D title screen theme, Paul stretched. Pretty much. I originally snipped about 10 seconds of the track, slightly Paul stretched it in Audacity, and then would use it over the years. It's a surprisingly good sample, and to be honest, I couldn't help but jump at the opportunity to really reference Gex in some offhand way. There's a really vaporwave-ish feel to that sound in the title screen, and admittedly I've always been kind of transfixed by it, in a way, whenever I've played Gex 3D. It's one of those games I just grew up with because I just so happen to have a PS2, and PS2s can play PS1 games, so yeah. So why not use it in my own works? So why didn't I put this track in Cathode Transit Highway or Cathode Transit Highway T-Sides, the expansion to Cathode Transit Highway? Admittedly, there is a really silly reason as to why that is the case. I personally feel that I ran out of time. At the time, I hadn't released a musical project in a while, and it bothered me immensely, to be honest. I don't feel pressure to make projects, per se, but I like letting fans of my music know I'm alive, if that makes sense. Cathode Transit Highway was my return back to making music for a while, but I just felt like Rascal in Motion wasn't ready to be put onto it. I didn't want to give people something that was so half-baked and not ready. So I kept it, saved it, and then decided to ultimately spruce it up and add it to SAPARi.Millennium. There is a good reason as to why it is here, and as I said already, you will find out why soon. Countdown to the Millennium Age. Track number 24, Countdown to the Millennium Age. Originally meant for Patchworks Volume 1, I eventually put it into Volume 1 of my Archive series, although I felt dissatisfied with just leaving it there. The core intent of this track was always to make something that felt like a countdown, like time was ticking down. Kind of like that feeling you get at New Year's Eve when they all count down to the beginning of a new year, you know? As such, it inspired me to give this track another chance, another spring in its step, and add it to SAPARi.Millennium, with the context being that SAPARi is such a game that would be updated somewhat for the dawn of the Millennium, hence the renaming of Countdown to Countdown to the Millennium Age. And that wasn't the only thing I decided to change and spruce up. In addition to the name change, I decided to properly master and change parts of it, providing two new melodies, one of which references Neco Genesis into the track. The first melody is provided by LMMS's very own Free Boy, an emulation of the general Game Boy sound contained as a ready-to-use instrument within the program. The second, which references Neco Genesis, is provided by the Seg guitar, which I admittedly adore a ton. What I didn't expect with this is for both Free Boy and Seg guitar when overlapping to sound genuinely really nice together. That might be silly to say considering that they're both built into LMMS, but 8-bit sound, synthy guitar with a twang to it, you know, they don't entirely sound like they'd cross over, but apparently in this instance they did. But they did here, and I am happy. Ultimately, I like giving old tracks that I feel still have potential a bit of new life, and Countdown fits, really, as, I guess in a morbid way, you could say that SAPARi's end of life began as soon as the Millennium came to be, what with how Sony would go on to treat the fanbase and the software itself. Doppler burn. Oh boy, this track. Believe it or not, I made this track across the course of 2 weeks with refinements during a period of time in 2024 in which I had virtually no internet connection, with the only thing I could really do being to just make music or play games, which, trust me, do get tiring after a while. But anyway, Doppler burn came from a desire to create something akin to the soundtrack within a TV show I absolutely adore, one of which you've probably seen Pyrocynical's thumbnail of in your YouTube recommended. Utopia. I freaking love Utopia as a TV show. This show fucking rocks, can I just say. Go watch it. Seriously. Yes, I'm shilling my favourite TV show. Shut up. But anyway, I wanted to try my hand at emulating the kind of sound from Utopia, or at least creating something within the same vibe as the show's overture and general theme. It's also got some context within Philanthropy, my own story project that I mentioned before, featuring my characters as the theme of a character with a particularly vengeful grudge. Perhaps I'll define that someday with an album for that character, but overall I wanted something that felt determined, angry, bristling, and I hope that intent came across within the track. Utilising LMMS's decimator to bit crush so much of the sound gave it a very bristling and unsteady feel, to which I like it a lot. In terms of its place within the album, the idea was to generally create a track that also felt like the dreamy feel of the past few tracks, that surrealism, fading out and resultantly causing the person within the album's overall narrative to wake back up, to begin a new day asunder. The air of dreams has burnt away to the crisp new day ahead. Dawn of a New Day. The final true interlude of the album, Dawn of a New Day, is straightforward. It defines the rest of what is to come. Waking up after sleep, the beginning of the album's end, and the narrative beginning to come to a close. But generally, it's also one of the simplest tracks that I made for the album. For anyone with a very attentive ear, you'll recognise the core sound as spliced segments of the PlayStation 2 boot-up sound, slowed down intentionally with, I believe, pause stretch. The way the PlayStation 2 carried itself in the early 2000s as a bit of an eccentric machine in its marketing and its black exterior, blue font design signifying the Earth surrounded by the darkness of space, yada yada yada, it's just kind of stuck with me. The point of this interlude was to give the listener something calm, docile, soothing to listen to after the intensity of Doppler burn and all the surreal stuff that came before it. I imagine the listener, or the person within the narrative that accessed the computer originally, is coming back from sleep, their consciousness and soul drifting through a black void as they slowly come back from dreaming, drifting back to the conscious reality around them. I love ethereal tracks, and it is with this that the album takes a bit of a more abstract and ambient turn. Eololis. Eololis, or Eololis, picks off from where Dawn of a New Day began, presenting the listener and in narrative the person at the computer with an ethereal, haunting sound that signifies a more naturalistic presence around them. The title itself is a bit of an extended reference. The name comes from Old Irish, Eolus or Eulus, knowledge, information, especially knowledge gained by experience or practice, acquaintance. The term has a natural touch to it, which is why I wanted to name the track as such. That, and it's also a particularly niche reference. I wanted to reference a program I grew up with watching on CBBC, the children's BBC television channel called Wolfblood. In short, Wolfblood is essentially a series about humanoids with the ability to become wolves, with the main crux of the plot being that Wolfbloods hide their existence from humanity, who are blissfully unaware of their existence. Eolas is a power Wolfbloods have within the series, to essentially tap into nature in a more powerful way, being able to sense everything from other presences to the small things like the wind on their back, footsteps far away, the pull of the moon, etc. It's a bloody cool power, and I just felt like referencing it. In terms of the sound, it actually comes from a TikTok of someone's computer reading what I assume to be Bible verses through an Apple Macintosh machine. It came up on my TikTok feed randomly one day, and I thought, shit, that's a cool sound, so I used it. I looped the sound over and over while gradually applying the decimator to it in LMMS to bit crush the sound, almost to signify that things are breaking down in this atomic sense. Things are becoming less artificial and more natural. Also to have a bit of a haunted feel to this section of the album. In a way, it's a parallel to Night Errors in that regard. Petraore Giants. I set myself a challenge for this track. I wanted to create a track entirely out of vocal sounds. And I mean entirely out of it. Everything that you are hearing here, that hi-hat sound, that's altered vocals through decimator bit crushing. The main melody, the bassy sound, all vocals. No artificial instruments or anything of that kind. But why? Truthfully, I wanted to do something different. I wanted to do something different, something that felt a little bit more abstract and natural in a way that literally felt as such. So why not apply it to its most logical extreme? I wanted something that felt like you were taking in the nature around you, like you were surrounded by spirits, perhaps of the past. The natural world around you, hence the name Petraore giants. Petraore is the smell of rain after it's hit the ground, the giants part of that title, intending to give off the impression that there are elemental forces afoot, like there's something more out there. Petraore giants that influence the world, a naturalistic presence. Utilising my own voice as well as a few other vocal samples here added this kind of personal touch to it that made me realise just how well my own voice could work for tracks, kind of inspiring me to be a little bit more confident about that compared to how I felt when making tracks like Honjo Engine, where it was a combination of shyness, a little bit of embarrassment, and just also not really finding much fun in using my own voice for lyrics. Originally, I was going to focus a little on the Irish tint that started with Eololis, through talking about and making Petraore giants, but I decided to name it Petraore giants and not really go too hard in on the Irish aspect. I love the Irish language and I love the culture, but I also think that there's not much use in naming something that way unless I have a particular intent behind it. Geom. Geom was actually never intended to be made. Bit of a strange thing to state, right? Well, it's the truth. With how well Petraore Giants worked out for me, and how experimental that track was, I felt like I could try something interesting. Mixing the vocals, the emphasis on that I used in Petraore Giants, with a track that has a more general structure, familiar, like Wayback window, for example. Merging these two parts together to create something interesting. Thus, Geom was born. I didn't really have a specific idea in mind for the feel of this track other than wanting it to feel like a pursuit, like you're pursuing something, like you've got rising determination in you to solve something or get something done. The name was primarily chosen as such to fit with Petraore Giants, to give it a bit of contrast, but to give off this impression that you were surrounded by a presence, a geo-messiah if you will, an earth god or deity that wants you to pursue it, or some general overall presence that encompasses you. I like that there's an air of finality to this track, which I feel works considering that we are approaching the end of the album. I think if there's something to specifically note, it's that I enjoyed being able to have such melodic variation in here, especially with inserting the philanthropy motif in here too. Speaking of... In the Shadow of a Scrapwork Dream, Lo-Fi Remix. Like Rascal in Motion, this track was originally something that had been meant for a previous work, specifically Cathode Transit Highway, T-Sides, an expansion to Cathode Transit Highway. Like I mentioned with Tiny Aibo, Toro Inoue, SAPARi and Susto Have Conversation, I'm not really that used to the lo-fi style of things, so I thought I'd try my hand at it here back when I originally was making this for T-Sides. Ultimately, I would finish it for SAPARi.Millennium, with its presence here relating to PachiiMochii's growing presence within the album. In the Shadow of a Scrapwork Dream is contextually the first track of Cathode Transit Highway, serving as the theme of philanthropy, the story I've kept on mentioning that I want to make with my characters, including PachiiMochii, and also where the philanthropy motif resides. The remix of this was accordingly made to just try and create a lo-fi rendition of that. I really like lo-fi music overall, and it's probably the only genre that I can say I have much interest in using a DAW, a digital audio workspace, and something that I want to actively pursue making in the future. I would really love to make a lo-fi album at some point. The key is to just understanding the style of lo-fi and how I can apply that through my own style. Really, how I can make something that fits lo-fi as a genre but also feels uniquely myself, if that makes sense. Neco Genesis, outdated 2022 prototype. Truthfully, I felt a tad nervous having this on the album. I don't really like broadcasting my old musical work, particularly if it isn't that good, and particularly if I'm not archiving it in, say, the Volume 1 archive album that I've made, but for the sake of history I wanted to have this here. This version of Neco Genesis you are hearing here is the original version of the track, made around 2022. The first teaser of SAPARi.Millennium that was ever given to the SAPARi community. A part of me does like how simpler this version is compared to the final version, seen at the start of the album, but frankly I like the final version more. The outdated 2022 prototype of the track served as the basis for the final, although it took at least 3 to 4 different iterations and project files for what is now the 2022 version to end up becoming the version at the album's front now. Perhaps if there's interest, I'll release those old awkward in-between versions someday. Depends if y'all want it. When listening to this version, I can not only hear the generally different mindset I had to music production at the time, the quirks I had with using LMMS at the time, but also reminding me of my days within university during COVID. During this period of my life, making music, art, YouTube videos was essentially stress release. My university course was horrendously managed, undermanaged, and underplanned, and a lot of it caused me to be extremely reclusive from teamwork and generally wanting to work with others on virtually everything. Accordingly, it's stuff like this version of the track that I made during that time that reminds me of how good it felt to produce stuff that worked, that I enjoyed during one of the most stressful periods of my life. Honestly, maybe this is a video's worth of subject matter to discuss in of itself. I don't know, maybe. All in all, I'm happy to show how I began with the album here, and I feel it's ultimately fitting for this album to start and end with the same track, I suppose. Noox and Patch. Noox and Patch is a track that, like Taxim, I made on a bit of a whim. No, that rhyming was not intentional. Anyway, the title refers to 2 characters, Noox and PachiiMochii. You already know PachiiMochii, mascot of my channel, my everything to do with art, really. But who is Noox? Noox is a character I created for one of my partners. As a fan of Jean-Michel Jarre, I probably butchered that name, I am sorry, and specifically the album Equinox, I created a character for him based on the watchers within the album's cover. Essentially, Noox and Patch is a bit of a duet between vocal samples of myself and him. I wanted something that felt personal for both of us, that there was an air of finality to it, that the pair of us stand at the end of this musical project together, standing at the precipice of the oncoming future, as most of the album has been about the past. I started SAPARi.Millennium years ago with being pretty alone, and I've ended the album with someone I dearly love, you know? It felt right to reference that, especially with the philanthropy motif. Old Machine. Old Machine is the penultimate track on the core album, serving as an inverse of the very start. Instead of the CNN weather loop being fast, the sample has been stretched, slowed, and eventually it begins to repeat. Repeat, 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 until the sound in narrative glitches and crashes the computer the person within the album is accessing. The person audibly gets irritated until they stop in place, because someone has called out to them. Someone who you've been having hints of all this time throughout the album, or seeing the presence of on the album. PachiiMochii. A conversation between creator and creation. Before I say anything, I highly suggest you go and listen to this track, either on the album or on the YouTube upload of the album. The point I was making with this track is, in my opinion, open to interpretation, but also quite straightforward. But I feel that what I say in it is generally straightforward in that regard. Now, with that out of the way, what does this track entail? The track entails the narrative of the album, in which began with an unknown individual accessing a seemingly abandoned computer all the way back in A New Morning for the Ancient Machine. Now, this person has been confronted by PachiiMochii, my avatar, my character, and the two engage in conversation. The narrative of the album truly unfolds as they converse. In reality, the person who accessed the computer within A New Morning for the Ancient Machine was me. I am the one who accessed the computer, booting up the Windows 95 computer, the computer brought to life, opening up the world of SAPARi and flooding the seemingly abandoned empty space with the contents of the album itself. All throughout the album, there are hints as to who is accessing the computer itself. The occasional sound of clicking or falling asleep in midnight into dreams indicating that time has been passing, hence the emphasis on the interludes appearing to allude to periods of time within the day. My voice also makes an appearance in Midnight into Dreams, indicating just who is the one at the helm of everything. In Old Machine, the penultimate track, the computer breaks down, becoming laggy and slow as I audibly exclaim my frustration with trying to dig into the computer more. PachiiMochii, however, my creation, confronts me, and myself and the fictional critter of my own design converse. While I have stated that the conversation itself is fairly straightforward, I do have some commentary on it. I was worried about having this one on here since it really isn't an actual music track per se, it's more or less a bit interpretive. But the contents of the conversation are crucial. I discuss the mentality I have around SAPARi, why I am here, why I made this album in narrative and out of narrative, how I like doing what I do for the sake of doing a good deed, really. My thoughts on being known as the SAPARi guy and the place SAPARi has within this post-pandemic world. Explaining that I wanted to make a SAPARi album, but just even better than what I've already done before. I explained that I'm happy with the way SAPARi is, what has been done, and how I am generally excited for the future. In the end, PachiiMochii and myself walk away from the computer, leaving it be as we walk out into the sunlight and feel the wind on our faces. It was a bit of a slightly ambiguous narrative, and I could have expressed it in a lot more blunt of a way, but I wanted to express that SAPARi doesn't necessarily need to constantly be maintained by me to exist, that things will end if I rest for a sec, but I have that connection to SAPARi implicitly nonetheless, and that it's important for me as an artist and as a creative to maintain it, while also getting on with my own life. It's why I wanted to make this track, really, as well as some of the interludes so ultimately ambient, because I wanted to explain my relationship with the game and what it means to me. I don't really like talking so honestly blunt about my feelings in this regard, so a conversation between creator and creation was very much a leap of faith in terms of what I wanted to do. I wanted to wrap up the bow on things really that I was trying to convey. In terms of the actual creation of the track, this is one of the tracks that I like a ton because instead of focusing on melodies and music in that regard, a lot of it was tweaking sound effects to create the impression of an atmosphere, to create atmosphere, to kind of get the listener envisioning and visualizing the conversation at play. I like tracks like these in musical projects, and I am definitely doing more of them in the future, but I thought that I would at least try my hand here and end the main crux of the album, the main portion of the album off, with something that really was a lot more atmospheric, just like the way it began. Clocks Go Back. And here we have the first of two bonus tracks. With this track I wanted something that in a way acted as a return to the beginning. The name, Clocks Go Back, encapsulates that. It's pretty much the simplest track on the whole album in that it's mainly just a singular synth line with the sample audio playing overhead. The sample audio itself is actually an old BBC One close down recording from 1981 about the clocks going back. I honestly just thought it was a cute little sample, and I feel that it fits within the next track particularly. You know, considering that we're going back in time, in a sense. In the shadow of a scrapwork dream, in the eye of the bittersweet seesaw. This is technically a track that has existed since Cathode Transit Highway and its expansion, T-Sites. With this track, however, I extended it to include an additional melody. The reason for this is that I wanted the track to feel like a bittersweet end to my time with LMMS. In The Shadow of a Scrapwork Dream, it's a track that I made for previously mentioned albums, and also Philanthropy, which I've mentioned before as the story in which my characters and Patchpop come from. Seesaw is the name of another story I also have in the works, of which I'd like to pursue. Something really bittersweet and sad, but meaningful. In a way, this track embodies not only that, but how I feel about my entire musical life in LMMS. I started off with knowing nothing, fumbling around in the dark a lot of the time, but I desired improvement. While I improved, the world changed around me and a lot changed in my life. I gained people, lost them, deaths in the family, saw the internet change and morph around me. I went through a lot, and I'll continue to do so, which I guess I'm fine with. Like the tides going in and out on a beach undergoing its sunset, I'll continue to sway back and forth, destined in a way to just keep going no matter the circumstances, going up and down like a seesaw. And with that, that's the entire album, but actually, there's one last thing. I've been hiding a secret, something that I worked on as one last ode to LMMS and paying respects to how I started, as I am moving to FL Studio. I have produced one last track in the program, a pseudo-sequel to Cyber Emperors within SAPARi.Millennium. The new track will be uploaded to the Bandcamp page of the album as the official 37th track. Feel free to check out the link, as you can see on screen right now, and I hope you enjoy it. And that, everyone, is SAPARi.Millennium, an album that I made with a lot of heart, with a few collaborators, and a lot of time. It was genuinely a wonderful project to work on, and in the end, I am satisfied with what I've made. Now, what will I do from here? In terms of my music, I've been adjusting to and working on FL for a bit, FL Studio. Nothing to show just yet, but I will one day be making an album, SAPARi, entirely within FL. FL shows so much more promise to me than LMMS currently does, and I believe it's time to move on from LMMS. I am thankful for how much I've learned in that program. I'm thankful that I began, a bit of a small-time career in music in that way. But I want to become better. It's in my soul as a creative to do so. See you all in the next video, folks. Be it CRT Dreams or something else.